During the late 16th and early 17th centuries, the political unification of Japan and an extended period of civil disorder. And this will be called something akin to the Warring States period in China. This period, however, is going to be called the Tokugawa Shogunate. This is the time when most people imagine Japan. Okay, when you have samurai warriors running around, territorial lords fighting for power amongst themselves, the emperor trying to maintain order, um, all sorts of movies going on about that sort of stuff. Talking about that popular culture, really focusing on this particular period of time in Japanese culture. Um, so, from the 1100s to the 1600s, a shogun, or a military governor, ruled Japan through retainers who received political rights and large estates in exchange for military services. This is very similar to feudalism in Europe, and that's why when you take these type of courses or when this period of time is talked about, it's called feudal Japan. That is a term we use. They do not necessarily call that this in Japan. And it's a sort of decentralized type of actual government. You have a territorial lord who then has his samurai who then have their retainers who are not samurai, just regular foot type fighters. The shogun ruled, theoretically, as a stand-in for the Japanese emperor, who again is the ultimate source of political authority, has the same sort of stuff we just talked about with the Chinese emperor. For the most part, the emperor was nothing more than a figurehead during this period of time. And the shogun ruled with absolute monopoly on power. After the 1300s, they sort of had a large war amongst themselves, a civil war, where shoguns and retainers led conflicts with each other to create war, trying to be the head shogun or the top guy. And this will be called the Sengoku in their terms. That just means the country at war. In the late 1500s, several powerful states emerged in regions of Japan, and a series of military leaders brought about a unification of the land. The last of these chieftains, Tokugawa Ieyasu, established a military government known as the Tokugawa Bafuku, and that means tent government. This was theoretically only a replacement for the emperor's rule. He and his descendants ruled the Bafuku, until the end of the dynasty. It's 267 years. That's from 1600 to 1867. They were trying to stabilize the realm and prevent the return of civil war. Consequently, they needed control of a group of people called the Daimyo. What's interesting is that 17 and 1800s in Europe, large territorial lords with different types of titles in Europe are causing lots of problems for their respective rulers and have to be brought in control. And the same sort of control will be put on them in France in particular, as well as England in a lesser effect, as it will be in Japan. The 260 or so daimyo functioned as near absolute rulers within their domains. Each maintained a government, staffed by military subordinates, an independent judiciary, schools, and they all circulated their own paper money. And many will establish relationships with European mariners during this period of time as well. Um, During the last decade of this era, cannons and personal firearms have played prominent roles in Japanese conflicts. So, from the castle town of Edo, modern day Tokyo, the shogun governed his personal domain and sought to extend his control over Japan. Um, Technically, the Daimyo in particular. They instituted a policy of alternate attendance, which required the Daimyo to maintain their families at Edo and spend every other year at the court. This established a policy in which the shoguns could keep an eye on the daimyo and their own regions as well. The shoguns also subjugated marriage alliances between daimyo families to the Bafuku's approval only, discouraged the daimyo from visiting one another, and they required them to obtain permits for construction work on their castles, meaning that they would be privy to any additions or changes in armaments or anything like that that could signify a problem for the shoguns. Even meetings between the daimyo and the emperor required the shogun's permission. The shoguns closed control of the region between the Japanese border and the outside world. They knew the Spanish forces had conquered the Philippine Islands at this period of time, and they feared that Europeans might jeopardize the security of the Bafuku itself. And they were kind of right about that in the end. So, how do they actually control the daimyo? What is it that they do that creates this sort of control over them? This will be what is called the floating worlds. Okay? And these are called ukiyo. These are entertainment and pleasure quarters where tea houses, theaters, brothels, and public baths offered escape from social responsibilities and the rigid rules of conduct that govern public behavior in the Tokugawa society. In contrast to the solemn, serious proceedings of the imperial courts, the popular culture was secular, satirical, and even scatological. If you don't know what that word means, you can look it up. The main expressions of this lively culture were prose fiction and new forms of the theater. In the comments for this, I will give you a link to a modern interpretation of this theater and give you an idea of what these areas were like. A really popular book was The Life of a Man Who Lived for Love, and he chronicled the experiences of a townsman who devoted his life, beginning at the tender age of 8, to the quest for sexual pleasure. There's all sorts of comedy and satire and other things in there, and all sorts of mishaps and what have you. So what this means for the daimyo is that in Edo and other major cities, there are all these wonderful distractions, and the government will not necessarily sponsor them, but they will certainly keep them alive. And this allows the Bafuku to do more and more of the government and less of the daimyo interfering in it. Because, hey, they're getting their territorial control, all the money coming in they probably would want in most cases, although greed creates more greed, but still, long as things were good and money didn't run out, they didn't have a lot to worry about now. So this sort of worked really well. And this is what the French will do. They will implement a policy very similar to this. Catherine the Great will do it in Russia in the 1700s. It apparently is a very effective means of distracting power away from people. So, you need to read the section on Christian and Dutch learning, persecution of Christians in the area, that sort of stuff. I'm going to end this particular recording and start another little clip on something on the Japanese culture that I want you guys to study up on, and we'll have your next small assignment over.